Armory National Historic Site. He is the author of Springfield Armory, Images of America, and co-author of a chapter in the Legal Guide for Museum Professionals entitled Managing Historic Firearms in Museum Collections. His articles have been featured in numerous magazines and journals, and he has appeared in several TV and YouTube programs focusing on historic firearms. So at this time, I'd like to introduce Alex MacKenzie in his presentation, The Final Push, D-Day to VE Day.
Thanks, everybody. While I get set up here, so of course, the Armory was 150 years old in 1944, and any locals know where that display was? Take a guess. No. It's in Johnson's bookstore down on Main Street. But let's see. So, following the lessons learned from logistical messes in World War I, the planning during the Second World War marked the most detailed and meticulous war plans in U.S. military history. As part of the services of supply, Springfield Armory was well established as the primary producer of infantry rifles for the military. Early war plans focused on the Armory, reduced the number of different military arms made at Springfield, and had the Armory concentrate on only making one thing, the U.S. rifle, caliber 30, M1, the Garand. Of course, broader war plans envisioned various scenarios at the strategic level for the defeat of Axis powers. And in any scenario, the military would need rifles. Just how many was the key. For the early part of the war, Springfield Armory was pedal to the metal in producing M1 rifles, but what happens when plans turn into reality? And when have enough rifles been made? The focus of this talk is on the last year or so of Springfield Armory during World War II. Through data and historical documentation, we can see these questions play out in kind of surprising ways. Of course, as time progressed, assumptions and plans change, and surprises in the field affect production on the home front. Looking at the story of Springfield Armory in this last year through VE Day and the end of the war, we can get an interesting insight into the overall strategic planning manifested at one major war plan. We're blessed today with hindsight, but by putting ourselves in the shoes of those who, in this very spot, were trying to do their bit and support the war effort as best they could with no knowledge at all of the future, we can see that some guesses turned out exactly as predictions thought, but others were completely unforeseen, and the Armory had challenges balancing the known with the unknown. And they were able to keep a vital war factory ready to respond to any change in need. So at its peak, in July of 1943, Springfield Armory employed about 13,500 workers, about 42% of whom were women, with a majority of all employees in the manufacturing jobs. Interestingly, the peak of M1 rifle production would come about 6 months later, in January of 1944. The Armory reported making over 4,600 rifles per day, which, as the lines were in full operation, translates to just under 200 M1 rifles per hour, which is a stunning statistic. But here we are again in hindsight, seeing about 4 months or so before the biggest invasion of mainland Europe, of course, D-Day. You might think production would be at 100% capacity through the invasion, but we weren't. Remember, the stats for January of 1944 were for peak production. It would never again get that high. So what was going on? In a nutshell, this was the end of planning for D-Day, as well as other ongoing operations in the Mediterranean and Pacific. There were needs for new rifles, but not nearly at maximum output. Orders for M1 rifles were cut, and Springfield Armory needed to be thoughtful about how it reacted. The Armory certainly recognized there was a lot of unknowns at this juncture, early 1944. They prudently recognized the need to sustain production somehow so as not to be caught flat-footed should the need suddenly spike. It would be a delicate balancing act. Springfield Armory was very good at making M1 rifles, In testament to its productivity, serial number 2 million was assembled in early February of 1944, while serial number 3 million was assembled that July, just 5 months later. And this is the receiver is serial number 3 million, which is actually still in the white, which is interesting in that picture, but if you want to see it completed, it's on display over in the museum. Actually, serial number 2 million is over there too. But interestingly, there's a million difference between those two serial numbers, but Springfield Armory just produced 500,000 rifles. Anybody know why that is? Any guesses? Yeah. It was Winchester. Winchester had the rest of that serial number block, so they were making about the million of the 2 million, 3 million range, 500,000 rather, and then Springfield Armory made the rest, and the best. But, so at any rate, in January 1944, the daily quota was set for M1 production at 4,500. In February, that number was cut to 3,600 and would remain there through May. By the end of the month, the Armory's commanding officer, Colonel George A. Woody, you see in that picture there, requested further cuts to the daily quota. He wanted to spread out the quota for the foreseeable future in order to help guarantee work down the road. It also makes strategic sense to keep the manufacturing lines busy with some degree of production to keep them from going dormant should a turn in the war suddenly demand a return to full-scale production. So in addition to reduced quotas to start 1944, the M1 rifle was actually delisted as a critical supply. Of course, rifles were still needed, but not in such a way that rifle production would be at the head of the line in the dispersion of scarce raw materials. Leadership at Springfield Armory had to scramble to keep production going, so the Armory grabbed work wherever it could. Moving forward through D-Day, instead of one giant line devoted to one product, the M1 rifle, the Armory's planning department broke up the lines in preparation for expansion of the jobbing shop, as they called it. Springfield Armory was a world-class factory and had potential to stay at full production capacity despite reduced M1 rifle orders. Any order for any product could theoretically be set up in pilot lines with careful reorganization of machinery and processes, and the Armory could use this fact to its advantage by taking on totally new production. The Armory's earliest M1 production had been in combat for 2 years, and many were in need of a tune-up. So while demand for complete rifles was slowly decreasing, there was still an important need to keep the rifles that were already made in working order. It would be an easy layup for Springfield Armory to take on as many maintenance orders for spare parts as it reasonably could fulfill. So it was standard to make certain numbers of spare parts per complete rifle made, and that continued. For example, as a rule, Springfield Armory manufactured 20 extra barrels for every 100 complete M1 rifles made. But as the Armory took on even more orders for spare parts, which would be assigned quotas between 1,500 to 3,700 pieces per day, for example, spare M1 rifle barrels were set at 1,354 per day. The barrel shop was also kept very busy with these orders, which included a dramatic increase in various types of 50 caliber machine gun barrels, and then with 500,000 of total types of 50 cal barrels. But not all departments were as lucky as the barrel shop with an abundance of work. Despite orders to the tune of 1,600 stock assemblies per day, the stocking shop actually eliminated its night shift in early 1944. The M1 clip line was fully capable of 3 million clips per month if needed, but they were not. And the entire clip line was shut down after April. Picking up new jobs wasn't always so straightforward though. For instance, the manufacture of poppet valves and M1 gas cylinder lock screws was transferred from contractors to Springfield Armory, but they had trouble manufacturing the parts. Design changes were necessary by engineering, but sections of the milling department slated to perform the work were now idle. Luckily, it didn't last long. The hunt for other work saved the line when the Armory received an order to manufacture 20,000 alternate feed bolts for the model 1919 A4 machine gun. This part required about 190 operations and was expected to keep the line busy for several months. And the Armory also snagged an order for 170,000 M1903 barrel assemblies. Though the receivers and barrels were made by contractors, the Armory would make fixed studs and sight bases and then assemble the whole. Luckily, the Armory actually still had Model 1903 tooling in storage, and it was able to bring it out and fire it up for these pilot lines for these parts. Actually, interestingly, this is just a generic photo as far as the Armory was concerned. This laser pointer. But, you know, their label for it is C-floor, which is the second floor of Building 102, which is right across the street, and it's the one on the right as you go into Federal Square. But if you look closely, you can see these ladies working in the bench, and this is part of the jobbing shop, but right in those racks are Model 1903 rear sight bases, which is kind of neat, because that's what they were doing. So, in work that would reappear after the war, this period also marked the first time that Springfield Armory received orders for M1 carbine parts. One order included 10,000 complete sets of parts, which was everything except the receiver. Another order for 312,500 carbine sights and 500,000 front band assemblies with the new bayonet lugs. Interestingly, the transition to spare parts meant more work for the inspectors, as well as the creation of more final inspection gauges where complete rifles were spot checked at, where complete rifles were spot checked at regular intervals, all spare parts had always carried a requirement for 100% inspection. As such, the laboratory and gauge section at Springfield Armory was comprised of highly skilled and thus critical and irreplaceable staff. All these new requirements for gauges resulted in the increase in allowable hours for staff. Women in the department, like these ladies here, were allowed 48 hours per week and was bumped up to 54. And then men in the same department went from 54 hours to 60 allowable hours, given the demand of work. One interesting statistic highlights the skill at Springfield Armory in comparison to contractors. Contractors who suffered from high turnover in their tool and gauge making departments were observed with an almost 10% rejection rate on first attempt gauges. Springfield Armory held the lowest war factory rejection rate of 2.73%, saving much time and effort keeping the lines going with the gauges they needed. The observed phenomenon at the time was actually called rejection complex and was the result of high turnover and lack of training, and it vexed industrial planning departments throughout the war. But the tool and gauge department at Springfield Armory was an interesting operation. Overall, the inspection department at the Springfield Armory was a pioneer in implementing in-process inspections, which is the subject of an entirely different talk. But this process would get a name in the 1960s, and they called it quality assurance, and in relation to quality control. These concepts many are familiar with, I'm sure, in the audience today, but in the 1940s, they were just in their infancy, and Springfield Armory was an early adopter. And I found this picture, which is interesting. It's actually from 1956, but you can see the tool maker literally grinding a tool, and the comparator plate is integrated with his machine. So you see the shadow profile of the piece that he's working on, and he's able to basically inspect it as he cuts. And this is all part of that quality assurance, in-process inspection that is improving manufacturing, and all that started during World War II. And so during the war, the increasing use of these comparator plates rather than mechanical or physical gauges had an impact on the low numbers of rejections at the Armory. The Armory's gauge division was a pioneer in the use of these comparators. In fact, a good proportion of the work of the gauge department here was for other people or other factories. Where the gauge department made 120 new comparator layouts for tools, cutters, and gauges for the Armory's machine shop, they also prepared 45 glass plate masters for Model 1911 A1 pistol, the Model 1903 rifle, the M1, and the Thompson submachine gun, and they were all for outside contractors. And then, in fact, the gauge department was also the lead instructor for teaching not only outside contractors the methods of comparator plates, but also provided assistance and training to government operations like Frankfurt Arsenal and Rock Island Arsenal as well. And aside from new production, the Armory was assigned C&R, or clean and repair projects, which the Armory hadn't done since before the war. This included 100,000 1903s, 100,000 M1 rifles, as well as 40,000 revolvers, a bunch of 22 caliber rifles, VARs, and even Model 1905 and M1 bayonets. They were all sent to Springfield Armory to manufacture, as the newspapers at the time pointed out. Now remember, all this is new activity for Springfield Armory. Up until 1944, it was all M1 rifle all the time. Now, operations instead became careful management of a wide variety of tasks, and operations became a balancing act to keep lines busy, cover for loss of employees or those on vacation, minimize downtime as production lines were adjusted to new products. This operational adjustment, no doubt, had impacts on the employees themselves. So employees had been working all out for over 2 years with uncertainty, but now shifts in manufacturing lines proved to be more anxiety-inducing than just continuing with the status quo. As mentioned, several lines were shut down and many employees were reassigned to different jobs, and a few were let go. But many employees needed to grapple with the fact that if they wanted to stay on, they might be moved to an entirely different job. The instability of jobs at the Armory moved to more diverse production had many employees anticipating massive layoffs. In fact, the anxiety was so pronounced, the commanding officer issued a memo in May to assuage employees' concerns. It has come to my attention that there is a feeling of uncertainty among some employees of the Armory about the duration of their employment here, said Colonel George Woody. There is work for everyone, and no layoffs are contemplated. In fact, right now we can use a large number of additional workers. If any employee knows of any person in good physical condition over 16 years of age who is either unemployed or not working in an essential industry, I would greatly appreciate it if they would give the name and addresses of those persons to their foreman, who will send the information to the employment division. In this way, you will be doing a great service to your country and to the Armory, as the need for help is becoming greater and greater. These people need not be skilled workers. They will be given instruction here. Springfield Armory wasn't actively laying off any of the workers as many thought. In fact, as Colonel Woody stated, the Armory was in desperate need for more people. The declining number of employees was almost entirely due to attrition. It wasn't easy working at the Armory. Many people who came into work without experience did not find the setting appealing, and many wanted to quit. The exit interviewer in the personnel department was actually able to convince about 10% of the employees that wanted to resign to stick with it. Interestingly, if a worker said they were leaving to take a better paying job, the resignation would not be accepted. But the Armory found that workers just ended up giving a different reason, if that was the case. But overall, the personnel department recorded as many statistics as it could to analyze the issue. For women, the most common reason given for leaving was physical conditions of work, poor health, exhaustion, or care of children. These were all included under the heading of fatigue, which was the stated cause of over 45% of female separations. Fatigue was the reason given for about 20% of male separations. The survey terms kind of made it difficult to differentiate between physical weariness and home needs, home and family needs, but the Armory tried to address the issues as best it could. For example, in late 1944, the Armory continued to arrange for child care and expanded as a way to retain women workers. And 8 different schools in the area were set up for child care services 6 days a week, generally from 7 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. Children from 2.5 to 4 years old cost $3 per week. Ages 4 to 12, in before and after school care, were charged $1.75 a week, and noontime care with a hot meal was $1. A private nursery on William Street could take infants between 18 and 30 months, but space was limited. And I actually looked up where on William Street the nursery was, and it's diagonally across from Frigo's. That's how we orient ourselves as in relation to freedom. But the biggest problem for employee retention was military service. Many departures, both for volunteers and draftees, could not be challenged. However, in a particularly creative solution, Springfield Armory requested the formation of a new ordnance detachment in 1944. The Armory had identified 47 men who were highly valuable, but nabbed by the draft. All of them were shipped off for intake. Remarkably, of those 47, 32 failed their physical and were declared 4F, and thus ineligible for Army service. But 8 of those chose to enter the Navy instead. But the rest would come right back to Springfield Armory, right back into their jobs. The 15 that did pass their physicals and went right into the Navy were formally enlisted, but then reassigned to this brand new ordnance detachment here at Springfield Armory, and they were quickly put back at their original jobs, although now in khaki uniforms and under the direct command of a first sergeant who was detailed from Aberdeen Proving Ground. This marked the first time, probably since the Revolution, where enlisted men were served directly on the manufacturing line. But of those 15 enlisted men, most of them were tool makers and machinists. One was a barrel rifler, and another was an engineer with the War Planning Division. And 8 of those tool makers, by the way, apparently were assigned to Building 28 in the experimental department. So we found an interesting anecdote from Captain Fino Truax, who was the officer in charge of the barrel shop. He related a story about that barrel rifler. His name was Private Walter Wesowitz, who had returned to Springfield from basic training. And there he is, got a picture of him. In the spring of 1944, Springfield Armory took on orders for a new part, M2 50 caliber machine gun barrels. Now, the Armory had already been making barrels for the 50 cal AN M2, which were critical aircraft armament, and you're going to hear from Marty as the third presentation on those. But Springfield Armory was making the barrels here, or a lot of the barrels. But those AN M2 barrels were 36 inches long. The regular M2 had a 45-inch barrel. And so the broaching machines at the barrel shop were set up for rifling the shorter barrel. Initial attempts to lengthen the operation resulted in varying widths of the rifling lands. So nobody could figure out. Enter Private Wesowitz, who had just returned to the ordnance unit after going through basic, and Captain Truax reported that he hit upon the idea of changing the lead of the helix of the first cutter from 1 turn and 14 inches to 1 turn and 15 inches, and the problem was solved. The longer barrels then ran through with no trouble, and there was a big backlog of barrels that was waiting for rifling, and that evaporated and the production orders were met. And despite challenges like the draft, clearly, Springfield Armory was able to benefit by the creative retention of skilled workers. And as you can see, by the time this picture was taken, for his efforts, Private Wesowitz was promoted to Tech 5, which is basically specialist nowadays. But a nice little bump in pay for saving our skin with machine gun barrels. So overall, the Armory promoted general welfare activities and benefits to keep morale up and limit turnover. The delisting of M1s as critical items actually provided some benefits to employees. The Armory was now authorized to allow 2 weeks of vacation to full-time employees, something that was not possible early in the war. Luckily, Springfield could rely on 90-day temporary employees, most comprised of high school students, to cover for vacationing employees over the summer. And if you look carefully, this is actually a picture. It just labels as the personnel department at the end of June 1944. And I was hoping you could see it well, but basically, those are all kids. They're all high school kids getting their summer job here over the summer. And looking closely at that photo is some real great expressions. It's awesome. One particular effort to retain employees was safety, particularly with turnover and new employees with little experience coming on the line. Armory Memorandum Number 21, which was issued early in 1924, required every woman in the shops to wear a cap to completely cover her hair and keep loose hair from being caught in the machines. 4 men and 4 women struggled to keep the safety aspect at the forefront, as many ladies wanted to impart a little style on the required PPE. Many apparently liked to wear the hat sitting just on the back of their head with their locks flowing out, like the image on the left. But a campaign was launched to reinforce the necessity of getting hair fully out of the way of machinery. But you can kind of see a distinction in the picture. She's not happy with keeping her hair up underneath that cap. I think there was a wire in it. You could put the wire in and it would make this nice halo versus taking all that stuff out and really getting your hair underneath. Next one is an earlier picture from 1942, but they had all sorts of safety pictures. But this one is really impactful, where that's a machine or a M1 rifle barrel that was in process. You can't really see it here, but that's a nest of hair that got wrapped around the barrel when it was turning on the lathe. Yeah, so be careful out there around machinery and loose fitting things and hair. Let's see, safety incidents or accidents actually rose during this time period, resulting in a loss of work. Safety staff recognized that many were not preventable in acts of God, but they needed they noticed a particular lack of supervision in far too many instances, such as failure to keep oil absorbents sprinkled on the floor to prevent slips and falls, permitting operators to work without goggles, without eye protection on machines, or lack of insistence on reporting every injury to first aid, or even assigning a new job to a person without experience, or giving them basic familiarity with safety features on machinery. But aside from personal safety, the Armory tried to find other opportunities for relaxation and entertainment to retain employees. The employee newsletter, the Armory News, was actually discontinued as of August 1943. However, the Armory Employees Recreational Association continued morale-boosting activity using non-government funds. The vending machines scattered around the Armory netted about $1,000 a month for the association, and this enabled sponsorships of sports teams, including bowling, basketball, softball teams, as well as tennis and archery, in addition to dances, balls, performances, and other events. Women seemed to enjoy the archery, which was hosted right out here in the parade ground in Armory Square, as well as swimming lessons were offered at the pool at Trinity Church. And the Armory also began showing movies during the workday, which workers were permitted to attend while on the clock. There were short war films, either news about the war itself or more morale-boosting films directed toward home front workers. This clip I'm going to show is from a longer newsreel titled just Film Communique number 9, which was shown to Springfield Armory employees on October 2nd and 3rd, 1944. The clip I'm going to show was preceded by a statement to home front war workers reading, quote, "You have often been told that the lives of our men depend on the precise and skillful quality of your workmanship. An equally important message on how to protect that workmanship has been given out to soldiers and sailors in training camps and combat zones through the following cartoon."
Will murder them bums and I'll bury them in the the latrino. Let stick him up or I'll blow your brains out. What a rifle! Kamerad! That rifle looks just a bit gooey. If you think I am scared, you're plumb screwy. Go on, fire away, buck your damn guns full of muck, or nothing comes out but just hooey. What a gun, I'm defeated. Such a gun just can't be beaten. That gun was neglected, no water connected, no wonder it got overheated. Now in the German army, mein lieber Herr, our weapons work fine, cause we give them great care. Now I'm sunk, I am thinking. Oh, you're perfectly safe, I am thinking. It's musty and dusty and mighty damn rusty. Conditions inside are just stinking. Really they are. What a downcop! What a clown! Just the kind of fool who lets his battery run down. No, like all careless gents, he winds up behind fence. Snafu is the world's greatest. Zero.
Hope you enjoyed that as much as they did back in 1944. Some definitely familiar voices in that one. And it is Mel Blanc. And Fritz Freeling actually did the direction on that, so. Looney Tunes. We were actually able to dig out a couple more films. If we have time, we'll show them. But we know which films were shown on which day in the cafeteria across the street in Building 111. So it's kind of neat to rewatch them and kind of put yourselves in people's shoes. But at any rate, not again. Let's go. Let's see. Let me get the next slide. There we go. So, Armory employees were also enthusiastically involved in war bond drives and contributed a stunning amount of money over the course of the war. On June 7th, 1944, the Armory announced the quotas for the 5th war bond drive, which was nicknamed Bonds for Bombers. Each department was allotted different components of 2 bombers with a grand total of $800,000 that would fund 2 complete B-17Gs. Each department was given a quota in proportion to their payroll size. For example, $7,000 roughly from the military department would fund 24 50 cal machine guns, 2 bomb hoists, and 4 pilot seats. Over $100,000 from inspection would fund 4 instrument panels and 8 propellers. The largest proportion, which was $266,519 from the milling division of the manufacturing department, would fund 1 fuselage, 2 wings, 3 motors, 1 fire control system, and radio equipment. With characteristic enthusiasm, Springfield Armory employees met their quota of $800,000 in the summer of 1944. And actually, future bond drives, the quotas were lowered for Springfield Armory since they threw in so many contributions in earlier drives. But the actual 2 bombers were ceremonially named Springfield Armory No. 1 and Springfield Armory No. 2, and were celebrated and photographed at Westover Field in Chicopee. At completion of the bond drive in early August, the crew of No. 1 spoke to employees at rallies, at water shops, and then at Federal Square. And the next day, the 2 B-17s flew over the Armory grounds in salute to the employees as they were allowed to stop work to watch the massive planes fly overhead on their way to Europe. As an aside, we were able to put some research into the planes. Of course, the Springfield Armory names were for fundraising purposes, but we could see their serial numbers, which were 44-8150 and 44-8158. You can see the little bit of 8158 there on the nose of that bomber, which was, of course, Springfield Armory No. 1. But when 158 there got to Europe, it was named Bobby Socks by her first captain. And provocative nose art was documented in several contemporary photographs. Avert your eyes. We don't know what happened to the other plane. I mean, both of them pretty much went over to Europe, served in various bomber groups, and then came back at the end of the war and were pretty much immediately scrapped. But there was quite an effort to retain employees and keep them satisfied on the job. However, as 1944 came to a close, total employment numbers continued to trend downward. By December, the total employment dropped down to just over 9,300 workers, which is a level not seen since early 1942. Echoing early memoranda, new commanding officer General Norman F. Ramsey released an all-employees memo on Thursday, December 14, 1944. Where he said, demands on the Armory have been so increased that our present force cannot keep up with the needs of our fighting men. The Armory needs several hundred more workers at once, and I'm appealing to you to talk to your friends about coming here to work. Echoing that earlier memo I read, he said, if you know any able-bodied men or women, boys and girls over 16 years of age who are not working in an essential industry at their highest skill, or who are not working at all, you can render a great service to your country by urging them to work here at the Armory. It was an interesting timing on this, which is 14 December 1944, Thursday, because 2 days later, on the 16th, this happened. For all the planning and preparations that went into the invasion of Europe, or the Pacific for that matter, the Allies could not see every eventuality, of course. The German surprise attack kicking off what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge rippled back through the front lines to the home front. Springfield Armory was already struggling with employment and trying to manage multiple manufacturing lines, and now, amidst declining personnel, orders for M1 rifles suddenly jumped back up by 50%. Springfield Armory was making 2,169 rifles per day in December, and the daily production would rise quickly to 3,500 rifles per day, where it would actually stay through VE Day. More employees followed as well, and March 1945 marked a return to over 10,000 employees. Despite these impressive numbers, Springfield Armory had trouble maintaining all its quotas, primarily due to the lack of production workers. Overall employment numbers went up, but in February 1945, the Armory assessed that it was still short by 692. Early April reiterated the need for 629 production workers, as well as openings for 85 positions for tool makers and tool grinders. Of the overall total, 470 workers were needed specifically for M1 rifle production. Not all the backlog on orders was due to Springfield Armory's personnel woes. Many parts were also farmed out to contractors who were having their own issues meeting deadlines due to supply shortages and other concerns. But Springfield Armory was able to bump up M1 rifle production mainly through the stockpile of many components of spare parts. Late in 1944, orders for spare parts were reduced, which left the Armory with a large supply of both complete and in-process parts. It was a stroke of luck to have these on hand to help Springfield with a sudden increase in orders in 1945. Because of reorganization of the manufacturing line, Springfield Armory also continued production on other weapons, one of which was the M1C sniper rifle. The M1C is basically an M1 with a scope mounted to the left side of the receiver, as you can see in this top photo. Difficulties in drilling and tapping receivers, hardening the receivers after, made the selection of highly accurate rifles very difficult. In fact, most often it was found that M1C rifles were less accurate than off-the-shelf M1s. But the scopes were sourced through the artillery branch of the Ordnance Office, which again provided further delays into the 1945, and it was really not a great rollout for what was supposed to be a highly accurate sniper rifle. Fortunately, John Garand and the Research and Engineering Department was already on the job. The previous summer, the department developed the M1E8 mount system, which you can see down below, which used a press-fit collar for mounting the scope. This resolved many problems, and it would eventually be classified as the M1D, but M1C production continued through the summer for issue to the field and into the end of the war. We really didn't see any M1Ds until Korea, which is amazing. Other R&D products were coming along. This previous summer, the department was developing trial weapons that would actually be adopted later. Aside from the M1D and M1E8, R&D was also working on the T4E1 carbine, which is a select fire mechanism that would be adopted as the M2 carbine. The M1E9, which incorporated a gas cutoff and expansion operation, as well as the T20, an M1 modified to select fire with BAR style box magazine, would both later morph into the M14 in the 1950s. In early 1945, the model shop was overseeing production of over 100 select fire T-22s for expansive trials. And finally, the Armory picked up production of the M3 50 cal bolts, which are part of an experimental project to increase the rate of fire of the Madu's M2 50 cal machine gun. In addition, these large orders for clean and repair work on all sorts of small arms, Springfield Armory actually had its hands full, juggling all sorts of work and the maddening ebb and flow of employee turnover. And then finally, a day that everyone was anxiously anticipating suddenly arrived. VE Day, the unconditional surrender of German forces in Europe. As many celebrated, the changes at Springfield Armory were swift, where the final push had an increase in production as well as employment. After May 8, 1945, production orders were slashed, and the process of a reduction in force was started. Of course, the war in the Pacific would continue, but troops and supplies from Europe would be shifted to that theater, making the production of new war material a much lower priority. By the end of June, the entire workforce was reduced to 7,000 employees, with the manufacturing department comprising just half. Production orders were canceled or dramatically reduced across the board, and the Armory employee reductions would continue into the summer, the only question being how would the Armory manage it? After VE Day, production continued but was dramatically curtailed. The Armory continued production of M1 and M1C rifles, as well as hundreds of thousands of spare parts. The C&R, clean and repair operation, reconditioned thousands of small arms and bayonets. The Armory had plans as to what post-war production would look like and recognized the need to ensure the facility retained a core of highly skilled workers for the long term. But that number would only be a fraction of wartime employees, and many people would need to be let go. Given the issues with the turnover and retention of employees during the war, the Armory had initially hoped that people would leave voluntarily. Many did, but not nearly enough. Some with permanent civil service status were offered other jobs, and some were released outright. Another issue was the return of veterans who were guaranteed positions after their enlistment expired, and there would be a preference for veterans, although not all would be able to return to Springfield Armory and were offered jobs at other government plants. War plans prior to the surrender of Japan looked to have Springfield Armory take over manufacturing of small arms traditionally completed by contractors, as well as more M1 production. When the Armory fully shut down its manufacturing line, it was in early production of new orders for M1 and M1C rifles, but the Armory had actually secured over secured orders for over 15,000 BARs, almost 60,000 M1 carbines, and almost 15,000 M3 machine guns. So we were this close from having Springfield Armory produced M1 carbines and 1918 BARs, which would have been pretty cool, but it didn't happen. As many historians have mentioned, there was also an order for 100,000 select fire T-20E2 rifles, which of course were planned for the mainland invasion of Japan. But delivery of these rifles was not expected until January of 1946. And the Armory still had yet to receive machinery and tooling from contractors, so Springfield hadn't really invested all too heavily in the manufacture of these before the war ended on September 2nd. But with the arrival of VJ Day, everything stopped. Everything stopped. All production orders were canceled. A workforce that numbered around 10,000 in the spring of 1945 was down to 2,000 by October. The heart of Springfield Armory, the manufacturing department, had 3,100 workers prior to VJ Day, and within 2 weeks, that number was 900. The procurement division had canceled 95% of all contracts. Now, those remaining on payroll would shift into peacetime operations. One of the first items on the to-do list was the cleaning and long-term preservation of small arms. Normally, these weapons would be packed in thick cosmoline for the long term, but Springfield Armory actually developed a canning system that would enclose a number of the guns in a can, which would be packed with 10 pounds of silica, desiccant, and given an airtight seal. The theory being that it was a lot easier to get these back in action if you would just open up the can and they were ready to go versus spending hours cleaning off cosmoline. But the Armory would spend the next several years making cans from scratch and preserving the weapons for the next war, which hopefully would never come. But this war was finally over, and Springfield Armory had a lot to be proud of. Its primary responsibility, production of the M1 rifle, had been a smashing success, providing one of the most advanced infantry rifles of the time to the bulk of the U.S. military combat forces. The final tally of M1 rifles manufactured at Springfield Armory was 3,519,471, an astonishing feat. And Springfield Armory and the country started the process of returning to peace, cleaning up and rebuilding the aftermath. The M1 production lines would stay silent for now. Thank you. I think we have a mic if anybody has any questions. Anybody got any comments? Yeah.
Quick question. You talked about employees being drafted,
Yeah.
but they end up being back here because of their value.
Yep.
Was that typical throughout the industry? Was that typical of war production at that time, or was that just unique to here?
That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, and the question again, if people didn't hear it, was that effort to retain drafted employees here and making a special unit typical? I don't know. The way I've seen it in the documentation, it seemed like a unique thing, a creative solution just for Springfield Armory, but part of me wouldn't be surprised if other places were doing it too.
Great. I have a question about the museum. So there was already an active museum at Springfield Armory, and you mentioned that like number 1 million or number 3 million, the grants were put into that. How was that process, if we know? Was it during the war or then after the war? Are they going through weapons and seeing what should actually be added in for either research and for research or for display?
Yeah, so they actually ended up boxing up the museum early in the war and put it into storage to get the floor space for other activities. I think it ended up becoming the personnel department. Maybe that photo of all the kids getting their summer jobs is actually where the museum was. So the museum was closed temporarily. And I know like serial number 2 million was on the commanding officer's desk as a display for a good chunk of the time during the war. And so a lot of this stuff wouldn't end up actually in the museum until the war was over and they reopened, which I think happened in 1946. But a lot of the R&D things, the experimental stuff, basically stayed with the R&D department. In there, they had a little mini collection of things they used actively. And then when R&D was done with those experimentals, that's when it would kind of shift over to the museum as kind of that long-term archive. So it kind of depended, but they knew, actually they said immediately, like they knew 2 million and 3 million as nice round numbers. Actually did it for 1 million as well, but would go into the museum eventually. And then actually they ended up giving number 1 million to John Garand when he retired in 1953.
I have a question about the title or the name of the M1 and all the various photos and stuff that you showed, and even in the one that's up right now, it says home of the Garand rifle, and in all the newspaper articles they kept referring to it as the Garand. When did it start being called the M1 instead of the Garand? Do you know?
Well, it's kind of interesting. When John Garand started in 1919, whatever project he was working on, regardless of any changes, they always called it the Garand rifle. Garand rifle versus the Pedersen rifle, and it just kind of had the inventor's name attached to it well before they even classified any numbers. And I kind of think that it's stuck. So the M1 was finally adopted and classified as the M1 in 1936. But people still kept calling it the Garand. That's what they called it for almost 20 years already, at least around here, and that kind of spread. So, and of course, the Army is really promoting the heck out of their star engineer. So the name was out there. So in a way, it was kind of both at the same time. And of course, early in John Garand's career, the newspaper is reporting it, and all they're calling it is the Garand rifle, even though it looked very different over the years. So yeah, I mean, if you want it to be official nomenclature, U.S. Rifle Caliber 30 M1, but colloquially, everybody just called it a Garand.
Thanks.
Do you have a sense or knowledge about what the percentage of the soldiers use the Garand rifle versus something else? And I'll harken back to my youth when I used to watch combat on TV, and Cage took the point with I think it was the BAR, but it seemed like that was unusual for their unit to have anything more than what probably was the Garand rifle. You'd see maybe one with a submachine gun and one with the BAR, but everybody else had, and you wonder, gee, wouldn't they be better off if they had more of the automatic rifles? Thanks.
Sure. It was actually prescribed. If you look up the tables of organization and equipment, there was a specific ratio on who got what, and it would really depend upon what type of unit it was, where certain, regular infantry squads would have mostly M1s, and then your sergeant would have a carbine or something like that. I can't recall it off the top of my head, but of course not everyone got M1s. You hear stories occasionally of people, getting issued one rifle and said, hey, I want the M1, and working their own deals. But in general, most combat infantrymen would be carrying M1 rifles, whereas officers, non-coms, would be the ones with the lighter guns or the sub guns or what have you. And I don't know exactly what the ratio would have been overall, but if you think about it, between Springfield and Winchester, about 4 million rifles were made, and that was plenty. But the U.S. Army in whole was like 11 million people. So, a little bit of a guess.
Where was the Winchester facility?
New Haven, Connecticut, right down the road.
Any other questions?
What was Winchester producing?
They were doing all sorts of stuff, but they had the only other contract to make M1 rifles. But they had a number of contracts open. All right. Very good. You want to go right into the next talk, Susan?
Yeah, we're gonna